Well, good morning. So this morning, I've been inspired by, believe it or not, a pastor by the name of Paul Vanderklay was talking about identity, myth, sorry. He was talking about myth and mythos, which, if you've listened to my podcast, you know I absolutely adore this idea. And he was talking about a video of somebody else talking about Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson's discussion. And the long story short was just that Richard Dawkins denies what mythos is, and yet engages in the use and even the creation of mythos. So is that, as PVK says, that ignorance? Is that stupidity, which is just, ignorance, stupio in Latin? I guess I'm repeating myself, but is it ignorance or is it malevolence, right? Is he looking to denature what he knows to be the foundational framework of society? But unlike Nietzsche, is he not providing a way forward? He's just destruction, just tearing down. So on that, I actually wrote a very short little aphorism that I think encompasses this idea. And I've taken it from Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, even Baudrillard and Joseph Campbell, if I haven't said him already. Who else? Matthias Desmetz. Just the simple idea that mythos are the stories that we tell and we live, whereas identity are the stories that other people tell that we live. So on that, I've scripted a little podcast that tries to get my ideas out in a little more of a cohesive pattern. Okay. Well, welcome to the podcast. We're going to unpack narratives, the narratives that shape us. For better or worse, today we're diving deep into two powerful forces: mythos, the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, and identity, the stories society tells about who we are. So our journey today brings together thinkers across time and philosophy: Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, Jean Baudrillard, and Matthias Desmetz. Each brings a piece to this puzzle of mythos and identity, our stories we construct, these stories we construct, and the ones imposed upon us. Let's explore how these frameworks interact, conflict, and ultimately shape our experience. To start, let's talk about mythos, the stories we need to tell. Joseph Campbell saw myth as an essential guide through the human experience, one that reveals universal truths about love, loss, transformation, and renewal. Myths, he argued, are not just stories, but maps. They offer frameworks to help us confront our deepest fears and desires, providing meaning in an often chaotic world. And I'll step in here and say that I would say it's meaning making, right? We, as Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell may even agree, we are the arbiters of meaning. That's Fritz. So we see into myth, into the world, and, right, in an uncertain world, we map myth upon it, providing meaning and a path through. But I proceed. Carl Jung brought myth down to the individual level with concepts like the shadow and individuation. To Jung, every myth echoes in an internal journey. It's our subconscious, our archetypes coming to life. Jung said that in facing our shadow, our darker sides, we move forward towards individuation or becoming whole. Mythos, then, isn't about finding a story we want to tell. It's about confronting the raw, unvarnished truth of who we are, truly are. And Nietzsche, Nietzsche, he takes mythos in a different direction. He proposed the idea of amor fati, the love of one's fate. He suggests that We live as if we would embrace our lives, all the ups and downs, over and over, in eternal return. Mythos, for Nietzsche, becomes a way of choosing our story with radical acceptance, even of life's darkest turns. And in English, we have a word for that. It's vicissitudes. If you can embrace the vicissitudes of life, then all the world and all that's in it is yours. So now, on to identity. The stories others tell about us. The labels and expectations society assigns. Hannah Arendt explored this when she wrote about the banality of evil, a concept that suggests identity can be co-opted and corrupted by social narratives. When people simply follow orders or act in line with societal expectations, they often surrender personal responsibility. They become, in her words, nobodies, vessels for ideology, losing their individual essence in a tide of collective identity. The herd beast, as Fritz talked about, or plain and simple, J. Krishnamurti talked about this, that religions often tend to fail because people come to them not to help in the path towards actualization and understanding of oneself and the world around us and each other, but usually as a placeholder for that struggle, that search. Usually come to religion as a way to understand the world and avoid the hard work of understanding for ourselves. Jean Baudrillard took this idea further in his work on the simulacra and the simulation. Baudrillard argued that in the modern world, we no longer live in a space of true identity, but in layers of representation. We become personas that are reflections of reflections removed from any authentic core. Identity becomes a mirage, a carefully constructed illusion that hides how little we understand of ourselves. And as Nietzsche says in the preface to The Genealogy of Morals, we are the knowers, but the last we'll ever know is ourselves. Matthias Desmet picks up on these ideas in The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Desmet builds on Arendt's work, showing how in modern societies, identities are often constructed by external forces, stripping individuals of their identity to self-define. He argues that this loss of self in a sea of identities imposed by media, politics, and culture creates the conditions for mass control. And then to remind you, this is the same gentleman that has been talking about this mass form psychosis. Mythos as a mythos as a path through trauma. So, if identity is so vulnerable to external manipulation, what can we do? One answer comes from mythos itself. Trauma experts like Jordan Peterson, I wouldn't say trauma experts, but psychologists like Jordan Peterson suggest that we can narrate our way out of our darkest experiences. Trauma isn't just pain. It's a disruption of the self's narrative. To heal, we need to find a new story to tell ourselves. Mythos becomes the bridge through trauma, the way out of a broken identity. Well, I apologize. I guess I wasn't clear enough on the prompt for this section, because I did not say anything of what it said with the trauma experts. I just said what I actually gave for a prompt was how Jordan Peterson explains that by narrating our past, we can actually make it more understood. And what he means by this is memories are very weird. Each time we recall them, we actually reshape them. So for the traumatized, what Nietzsche called ressentiment, which is a French word that he appropriated. And in his mouth, ressentiment is to re-sentiment. It's to re-experience a past trauma, past experience in the present as if it were happening now, as if it were real. So it's to re-experience the trauma. And what we found out about memories is if you continue to access old memories in a traumatic mind space, what you're doing is forming that memory into a greater trauma, a more traumatic memory. When in reality, as I've seen myself, when you go back and explore these traumatic memories, they often tend to be much less intense than we have turned them into over time, right? So here's Jung's concept of shadow work. Here, Jung's concept of shadow work returns. By facing the parts of ourselves that society may prefer we ignore, our fears, insecurities, anger, we step closer to our true identity. Only by embracing the shadow can we resist the imposed identities that Desmond and Arendt warn about. To live mythically is to live authentically, to build a story that reflects our truest self. Well, this one's the toughest because truly, as I said, I gave it a prompt about McLuhan talking about that there may come a time when we might externalize ourselves to such an extent that we couldn't recollect ourselves. I apologize. He explains that we externalize ourselves to understand our environment. But there may come a time when we'd externalize ourselves to the point that we would just be, completely dissolved, right? And we find it near impossible to recollect ourselves. But I think, again, when we play with these little aphorisms, I think he was also talking about this idea that when the noise gets too loud, we have a hard time differentiating what is us and what is others, as Martin Buber talked about. This another aspect of the individuation process requires that you learn who you are in a complex within the interrelationship of self and others and the world around us. And so that means we need to engage with these myths and these identities, as Jung would call them, these personae. Right? So you have a choice. Is your persona going to be assimilation within the simulacra? Or are you going to be an authentic agent within, right? As Shakespeare said, all the world is a stage and we're but actors upon it. But can we be authentic agents? That's the question. So mythos and identity in modern culture. Today, we see a collapse between mythos and identity. Social media, mass media, and modern culture blend the two, creating confusion about what is ours and what is imposed. Our personal myths are always instantly hijacked by likes, by shares, and by media narratives. Nietzsche warned that when we lose the ability to create and embrace our own myth, we lose our ability to see who we really are. So how do we reclaim mythos in a world of simulated identities? How do we stand apart from the personas that Baudrillard described, from the hyper-real culture that distances us from authenticity? The answer might lie in living mythically, as Jung and Nietzsche suggested, creating and owning a personal narrative that's honest, complex, and perhaps even difficult. No, must be difficult. Otherwise, as I've said in a previous, I don't think I've published that podcast, but this idea that we only get better, right? Remember, I've talked about this. We're atrophying, we're getting worse or we're getting better. And memory science may actually agree on this. So long-term memories are only registered properly for the long term if we're deeply engaged, right? So if we don't deeply engage, if we aren't activated by our myth or by our identity or by our truth, then that won't be real. We won't embody it. So the idea of myth and memory kind of coincide here in the idea that myth is only truly real when we truly live it. Shraddha in Sanskrit is faith, but it means devotion and commitment and confidence. Trust in Latin could be a synonym for faith. But do we see our fate as imposed, or do we see it as an opportunity for us to live authentically? That is my question, right? So it's a process of constantly telling our story in a way that incorporates both myth and shadow, acceptance and action, and maybe the first step is the hardest, realizing that our story is all we have. Oh, absolutely. So thank you for joining me on this exploration. Today we've walked through the realms of myth and identity, touching on the philosophies of Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, Jean Baudrillard, and Matthias Desmond, to name a few. And yet, the journey is far from over. Our stories are only the beginning. Until next time, remember, the stories we live are the ones we choose to tell. So thank you very much once again. Sharing my journey in the hopes that it may be somebody's survival guide.